I went to the cabin because I wanted quiet. That was the only reason. I picked a random one far from towns, far from people, far from everything. I didn't even look at reviews. I just saw the pictures, saw the trees around it, and booked it. I had been feeling worn out for weeks, and I wanted a place where I could breathe without hearing traffic or phones or voices. I thought the cabin would help me reset. Instead, it turned into something I still think about at night when the house gets too quiet. The drive took longer than the map told me. The paved road ended earlier than expected, and from there, the dirt path curved deeper into the forest. The trees grew so tall they blocked most of the sky, and the air changed as I kept going. It got colder, stiller, like the wind didn't reach that far into the woods. The cabin finally appeared after a sharp turn. Small, dark wood, a roof that dipped a little in the middle, and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. It sat alone in a clearing that wasn't even much of a clearing since the trees pressed in close from every side. The first thing I noticed when I got out of my car was how quiet everything was. No running water, no insects buzzing, no birds, nothing. Just the soft groan of trees shifting when the wind barely moved them. The ground around the cabin was uneven, covered in dead leaves and small broken branches. The porch steps felt loose under my weight, and the metal handle of the door seemed colder than it should have been. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The air felt trapped, like no one had opened a window in months. There was one main room with a bed pushed against a wall, a small kitchen area with a sink that looked older than the cabin itself, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood stove. A door in the back led to a cramped bathroom with cracked tiles on the floor. The place wasn't dirty, but it wasn't warm or welcoming either. It felt like someone had cleaned it quickly and then left without looking back. I unpacked slowly, trying to get comfortable, but something about the space didn't let me relax. Every time the cabin creaked, I stopped and listened. Every time the wind touched the walls, it felt like something brushing against them. I kept telling myself it was just because I wasn't used to being alone in the woods. As the sun went down, the inside of the cabin grew colder. I tried lighting the wood stove, and after a few minutes of struggling, it finally came to life with a low crackle. The warmth helped a little, but the shadows in the room felt thicker somehow. I kept pacing, checking the windows, checking the corners, telling myself I needed sleep. When I went outside to grab more firewood, that was the moment things started feeling wrong. There were footprints near the side of the cabin. Not mine, not old ones either. Fresh ones pressed deep into the dirt and leaves. They led away from the tree line, circled the cabin slowly, and then disappeared behind it. I stood there for a long moment staring at them, my chest getting tight. My brain tried to explain it. Maybe hikers passed by, maybe the owner checked the place recently. But they were deep, clean tracks, not washed out or softened by weather. They were recent, very recent. I grabbed the firewood faster than I meant to, checking the trees over and over. Nothing moved, but I felt watched. The longer I stayed outside, the more the air felt like it was pushing me back indoors. I didn't last long out there. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling as the wind made the cabin creak. Every small noise felt bigger. Every small shift felt closer. I kept drifting in and out until something pulled me awake. A sound just outside the cabin. Slow movement. Something stepping on leaves. Not an animal. Too heavy, too steady. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. The footsteps moved around the cabin, circling it the same way the footprints had. They would stop for long stretches of time, then continue. At one point, they stopped right outside my window. I stared at the dark ceiling, barely breathing. I heard the soft crunch of leaves shifting, like someone turning their weight slowly, carefully. They stayed there for so long I started to feel sick. Then the footsteps continued, quieter this time, until they faded completely into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, the cabin felt colder than before. Not just in temperature, colder in a way that made the air heavy. I went outside slowly, scanning the ground first. More footprints, fresh ones, circling the cabin again, but this time closer. Some almost touched the porch. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. deep, sharp heel marks. Someone had been walking around the cabin again while I lay inside pretending not to breathe. I checked the trees, my heart pounding, but the woods stood still. No movement, no sound, just endless trunks fading into the shadows between them. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just out of sight, still watching. The day dragged. I stayed inside most of the time, sitting near the stove with my back tight and my legs restless. Every so often I would check the windows, expecting to see someone standing there. I tried to distract myself, but the silence made everything worse. At one point I decided to step outside just to breathe air that didn't feel stale. When I opened the door, the first thing I saw was the firewood I'd stacked earlier. But now it wasn't stacked the way I left it. It was pushed into a neat, straight line along the wall, like someone had arranged it carefully while I was inside. My stomach dropped when I noticed small things like that. A rock moved near the porch. A long stick set across the path that hadn't been there before. Tiny changes, small shifts, but very deliberate. Someone had been coming close. Very close. I didn't want to stay after that, but I told myself I could handle one more night. I didn't want to drive down that rough road in the dark. I spent the whole afternoon sitting by the window, watching the edge of the woods. I felt like any second I would catch movement. The sun set slowly, and the moment darkness took over the clearing, the cabin felt smaller. I lit the stove again, even though I didn't need more heat, just sound, any sound that wasn't from outside. I sat at the table with my back to the wall, staring at the front door, waiting. It didn't take long. I heard footsteps again. Softer this time, but close. Too close. The sound moved from the front of the cabin to the side. Slow steps, careful ones. They stopped at the wall beside the kitchen. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard a faint dragging noise along the wall. Something brushing against the wood from outside. Moving slowly as if the person wanted me to hear it. My heart pounded so hard my arms felt numb. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The dragging stopped near the back, and then everything went quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where every nerve in your body tightens because something is still out there. I stayed awake until morning, gripping my bag like it would help me somehow. The footsteps didn't return, but I kept hearing soft shifts outside, like someone crouching in the dirt or brushing against the trees. When sunlight finally hit the clearing, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't stop to fold anything or check anything twice. I just wanted to leave. When I opened the front door, I froze. There were fresh footprints on the porch. Just one set. They led right up to the door. Right up to where I had been sitting only hours earlier. I didn't think. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove down the dirt road so fast I almost slid off the turns. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road miles away. Only then did the shaking start. When I got home, I checked the cabin listing out of curiosity. It was still online, but the pictures looked older. Way older. And in one of them, it took me a minute to notice this. The cabin didn't have any curtains. But the cabin I stayed in had curtains. Old, dark ones that looked like they'd been there for years. I don't know who put those curtains there. I don't know who kept walking around the cabin at night. I don't know who touched the firewood or stood outside my window or dragged something across the wall while I hid inside. But I know this now. Whoever it was wasn't passing by. They knew that cabin. They were comfortable around it. Too comfortable. They watched it the whole time I stayed there. They knew the woods. They knew where to stand to avoid being seen. They knew how to move without making too much noise. And the only reason I made it out was because they didn't decide to come inside. The real terror wasn't what I heard. It was what they chose not to do. That's the part that still keeps me up sometimes. The knowledge that the person out there wasn't clumsy or curious. They were patient, quiet, and used to hiding in the woods. And they didn't make a mistake. They just let me leave. I headed to the small cabin deeper in the mountains because I needed a break from everything. I picked it randomly off a rental site, the kind of place that barely had pictures and only mentioned that it had running water when the pipes behaved. I didn't care. I wanted quiet, cold air, and space where I could hear my own heartbeat. I left early in the morning, hoping to beat the weekend travelers, but by the time I reached the last dirt road, The sky already felt heavy, like it wanted to fall straight down onto the trees. The road climbed in slow, rough angles. Gravel kept tapping the underside of my car, and each turn grew tighter. I kept waiting for the cabin to appear, but it didn't. My GPS froze and then died completely. My phone lost signal miles back. The only thing ahead was the narrow road and the pine trees pressing up on both sides like they wanted to swallow the whole place. When I finally saw the cabin, it came out of nowhere. It almost felt like it had been hiding from the road. It was small, darker than the pictures online, and surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sky. The porch leaned slightly forward, like it was tired of standing straight. A single metal chair sat near the door, rusted and dented. I stepped out of the car and felt the cold immediately. It wasn't freezing, but it was sharp enough to get into my clothes. Inside the cabin, the air felt stale, like no one had opened a window in months. Dust covered the floor, and something about the silence felt heavy. The place had the basics: a bed, a small kitchen area, a table with uneven legs, a wood stove that looked older than the cabin itself. I unpacked slowly, trying to adjust to the stillness. I kept telling myself I was here to relax, but something about the air, the way it sat still and heavy, kept me on edge. When I went outside to bring in firewood, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, like someone had been there recently. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe a ranger had checked the property. Maybe the last visitor had left later than the listing said. I kept reaching for simple explanations because thinking too much only made my chest feel tight. Still, I walked around the cabin, slowly scanning the trees. Nothing moved except for the wind-shifting branches. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. I made a small fire in the stove, cooked something simple, and sat on the bed with my back against the wall. The cabin creaked every now and then. I tried to ignore the sounds, but in a place that quiet, every noise felt sharp. I wasn't tired yet, so I walked around inside the cabin, opening drawers, checking corners. I didn't know why. Maybe it was because the place felt like someone else had been there not too long ago. It wasn't until I opened the small cabinet under the sink that I froze. A jacket sat folded inside, but it wasn't dusty. It was clean, newer, and not something you'd expect to find in a forgotten cabin in the woods. The tag on the collar still had a store label on it. I checked the pockets. Empty. No name, no receipt, nothing that told me who had left it. I put it back exactly how I found it and closed the cabinet quietly, even though I was alone. I tried to sleep early, but lying in that dark room with the wind scraping against the walls made it impossible. I kept drifting in and out. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something shifted around me. At one point, I heard footsteps outside, slow, careful ones on the dirt. I held my breath and listened. They moved around the cabin, then stopped. I waited for a knock or a voice or something that made sense. Nothing came. After a minute, the footsteps continued until they faded out into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the air inside the cabin felt colder than outside. I checked around the porch first. The footprints from the previous day were still there, but now there were more. Fresh ones. They went straight to the back of the cabin. I followed them slowly, my hands shaking even though it wasn't that cold out. Behind the cabin, the dirt looked disturbed, like someone had stood there for a long time. But the trees were so still, and there was no sign of anyone. I decided to stay outside for most of the day because being inside the cabin made my skin crawl. I walked down the small trail near the property, trying to clear my head, but the deeper I went, the more it felt like someone was walking behind me. I kept turning around and seeing nothing but straight, silent trees. The air felt too quiet. Even the birds stayed away from that part of the woods. When I returned to the cabin, I saw something that stopped me cold. The metal chair that had been by the front door was moved. Not a little bit, completely turned toward the woods, as if someone had been sitting there watching the tree line. I knew for a fact I didn't move it. I stood there staring at it, feeling the back of my neck tighten. There was nothing around me but empty trees and that silent cabin, but I felt watched. Inside, the air had changed again. The faint smell of dirt and cold air sat inside the room like someone had just walked through. I checked the doors. Still locked. The windows were closed tight. But the jacket in the cabinet was gone. The cabinet was empty. The dust inside shifted, like someone had reached in. I didn't think. I started packing immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped things over and over. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of that place. While I was stuffing things into my bag, I heard something move outside again. Footsteps. Closer this time. I grabbed my bag and sprinted to the front door. When I opened it, the footsteps stopped. I didn't look around. I didn't want to see anything. I ran straight to my car. I threw my bag in the back, jumped inside, and locked the doors. The trees looked even taller than before, like they were leaning inward. For a moment, I sat there trying to calm down enough to start the car, but then I saw movement in the side mirror. A figure standing just behind the back corner of the cabin. I couldn't see the face, just the outline. They weren't moving. They were just standing there, watching me. I didn't wait to make sense of it. I started the car so fast the engine almost choked, reversed too hard, and tore down the dirt road without looking back. The road felt longer than when I arrived. Every turn felt like something was about to step out in front of me. My hands didn't stop shaking until I hit the main paved road miles later. I didn't call anyone. I didn't make a report. I just went home and tried to forget the cabin, the footprints, the missing jacket, and that figure behind the building. Weeks later, I checked the rental site again out of curiosity, even though I didn't want to. The listing was gone. The entire page for that cabin didn't exist anymore. It wasn't marked as unavailable. It was completely erased, like it had never been posted at all. That was when it hit me clearly. Someone had been staying there without the owner knowing, or maybe the owner didn't care. Someone was living around that cabin, watching it, watching anyone who stayed there, and I had slept in their space without knowing it. The ending became clear the longer I thought about it. I didn't escape a ghost or a monster. I escaped a real person. Someone quiet, patient, and comfortable moving through the woods without making a sound. Someone who had been close enough to the cabin to leave footprints all night. Someone who took their jacket back while I slept. Someone who watched me from the trees and stood behind the cabin as I ran for my life. And they knew the woods better than I ever could. If they had wanted to stop me from leaving, they could have. The only reason I got out was because, for whatever reason, they let me. I drove into the mountains with nothing but my car, a backpack, and the vague promise of peace. I wanted to get away from the city, from people, from the constant noise that never let my mind rest. The cabin I had booked was off the grid, somewhere deep in the forest where the roads weren't even marked on my GPS. I didn't mind. I wanted isolation. I thought the harder it was to reach, the more it would feel like it belonged only to me. The last stretch of road was gravel, uneven, and steep. Trees pressed close on either side, their trunks thick and dark, blocking the sun almost completely. The car rocked over loose stones, and I felt my stomach tighten with every turn. There was no cell signal, not even a flicker. The last map pin on my phone showed I was close, but the forest stretched in front of me like it wanted to swallow the road whole. I started to wonder if anyone else had been here at all. When the cabin finally appeared, it felt like it had been dropped into the clearing without warning. It was smaller than I imagined, made of dark timber that had faded over years. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch leaned as if it had borne too many storms. A rusted chair sat crooked on the side, and the wood under my feet creaked as I stepped toward the door. The air around it was dense, cold, and still, so still it made the silence feel heavy. Inside, the smell of damp would hit me first. Dust coated every surface. The main room held a small bed pushed into the corner, a crude kitchen area with a sink, a wood stove, and a table with two rickety chairs. The windows were grimy but mostly intact. A small bathroom with cracked tiles was tucked behind a door at the back. The cabin had the basics. It wasn't warm or inviting, but it wasn't abandoned either. It had the feel of a place someone could leave quickly and return to later. I set my backpack down and tried to shake the feeling that I was already being watched. I went outside to collect firewood, and that's when I saw the first sign that I wasn't alone. Footprints. Fresh human footprints pressed deep into the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. They went around the perimeter and disappeared into the trees. I froze, my stomach tightening. Maybe someone had been camping nearby. Maybe a ranger had checked on the place. But these prints weren't shallow. They were deliberate, fresh, and perfectly human. I forced myself to ignore them and went about gathering wood, though I couldn't stop glancing at the trees. Night came quickly. The wind kicked up and made the cabin creak in ways that made me tense. I tried to start the wood stove, finally coaxing it into a low, steady flame. I cooked a simple meal, ate standing up, and tried to settle into the bed early, hoping exhaustion would drown my unease. I lay there in the dark, listening to the soft groan of the cabin and the wind outside. Every little sound felt amplified. The smallest tap or scrape made me tense, my pulse jumping. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Outside, around the cabin. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. The steps moved along the perimeter, stopping at the window beside the bed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound lingered, sharp against the night, then faded. I waited until my ears ached, but there was no return. The footsteps were gone, but the knowledge that someone had been moving around the cabin, watching, lingered like smoke in my lungs. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay fully dressed, listening to the cabin and the woods, heart hammering with every shift of the wind. Morning light brought little comfort. The footprints from the night were still visible, new ones added alongside the old. Someone had been there. Someone had moved through the trees, around the cabin, and I hadn't noticed until it was too late. The day dragged. I tried to keep busy, chopping more firewood and pacing the small cabin, but the unease never left. I checked the windows repeatedly, scanning the edge of the tree line for movement. Nothing. Yet I knew someone had been close, very close, while I tried to pretend I wasn't aware. By afternoon, I started noticing small things out of place. A chair slightly shifted. A rock moved from the side of the porch. The firewood I had stacked neatly earlier was scattered along the wall. Tiny changes that made no sense unless someone had been moving through the cabin while I wasn't looking. My unease grew into outright fear. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, tossing my belongings into my backpack with shaking hands. I didn't bother to straighten anything or tidy up. I just wanted out. As I swung the cabin door open, my stomach sank. Fresh footprints led up to the porch and stopped right in front of the cabin door. One set, a single, deliberate path that ended there, like someone had stood and waited. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself into the car, locked the doors, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared. The road was rough and narrow, but I didn't care. My hands trembled, gripping the wheel, my pulse deafening in my ears. I didn't slow down until I hit the main paved road, far from the cabin. Only then did I realize I was shaking all over. I drove straight home without looking back, without stopping for anything, and didn't speak a word. Weeks later, I checked the cabin listing online. It was still up, but the photos were older. One photo caught my eye. The cabin in the picture had no curtains. The cabin I stayed in had dark curtains that were frayed at the edges, old but obviously in use. I hadn't noticed them at first because I assumed the cabin would be as the photos showed. Now, it made sense. Someone had been living there, or at least using the cabin, without leaving a trace. I thought about the footprints, the moved firewood, the chair shifted on the porch, the sounds outside at night. I thought about the careful, deliberate steps that circled the cabin, the patience it must have taken to remain unseen, and the way someone had let me leave. There had been no ghost, no fairy tale creature, just a person, or maybe more than one, who knew the woods, who knew the cabin, and who had watched me without ever revealing themselves. The fear wasn't in what they did. It was in what they chose not to do. They never entered the cabin. They never confronted me, but they could have. Every footstep, every movement outside was a reminder that someone had control over that space, and I was completely vulnerable inside it. I had been alone, but I had never been safe. The ending became clear only later, when I could think about it calmly. I survived because the person or people who lived near that cabin decided to let me. Not because I was clever or careful or lucky, but simply because they were patient and observant, and they knew I didn't belong in their space. I never went back. I never stayed in an isolated cabin again. And every time I remember the way the forest pressed close to that small, dark cabin, I realize the real horror isn't in the night or the dark or the isolation. It's in the quiet knowledge that someone can watch you, move around you, and you won't even know it until you're already in danger. I learned that lesson fully that night. Not from shadows, not from wind, not from the creak of wood, but from someone real, someone deliberate, someone waiting, always patient, always unseen. And that's the only ending I can make sense of. I escaped, yes. I made it home, but I also knew with absolute certainty that if the person had wanted, I wouldn't have. The woods were theirs, and I had been foolish enough to wander into them. I drove for hours, winding up narrow mountain roads that seemed to get rougher with every mile. I had chosen the cabin randomly, a last-minute decision when I realized I needed time alone. Away from people, away from the city, away from the noise that seemed to follow me even in my sleep. The GPS stopped working somewhere halfway through, leaving me relying on old paper maps I had printed for the trip. The roads were overgrown in places, gravel crunching under my tires, and the air felt heavier as I climbed higher. By the time I saw the cabin, I was already on edge. It sat in a small clearing, almost swallowed by the surrounding trees. The wood was darkened by years of weather, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A small porch leaned to one side, a single rusted metal chair sitting crookedly near the door. The windows were dusty, the kind of grime that made it impossible to see inside clearly. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in from all sides, like the trees were holding their breath. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and rotting leaves. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood that hadn't been aired in years. Dust coated every surface. The main room was small and functional. A bed pushed into a corner, a table with two uneven chairs, a small kitchen area with a sink that looked like it hadn't been used much, and a wood stove that seemed older than the cabin itself. A door led to a cramped bathroom with cracked tiles and a faint mildew smell. It wasn't dirty exactly, but it wasn't clean either. The air felt heavy, stagnant, as if it was holding on to every sound and movement. I unpacked slowly, trying to make sense of the place, and tried to convince myself I was here to relax. I brought in firewood for the stove, stacking it neatly in the corner, and went outside to survey the small clearing. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh human footprints, pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the edge of the tree line to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine and they weren't old. Someone had been here recently. My stomach twisted. Maybe a previous visitor or the owner had checked the place. I tried to reason it away, but the prints were too clean, too deliberate, too fresh to ignore. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped quickly. I started a small fire in the stove, trying to create some comfort. The shadows inside the cabin stretched long and dark, moving as the fire flickered. I ate a simple meal, pacing the cabin to keep warm, checking the windows repeatedly. Every creak of the floor, every tap against the walls, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was the wind, or the old wood settling, but my gut said otherwise. Night fell, and I lay on the bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. Every noise from outside felt amplified. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of small branches, the occasional scuff of something heavier moving in the dirt. Then I heard footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. Not the quick step of an animal, not the faint touch of wind moving branches, real footsteps. They moved around the perimeter, stopping and starting, pausing near the window beside the bed. I held my breath, counting silently, listening as they shifted away, faded, then returned. The tension was unbearable. I stayed frozen until the sounds disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep, not an hour. The fear sat in my chest, heavy, unrelenting. Morning brought no relief. The footprints remained, more appearing alongside the first ones. They circled the cabin in deliberate patterns, sometimes stopping at the porch, sometimes leading off into the trees. Someone had been here all night, watching, waiting, and I had been too consumed by the cabin's walls to notice. During the day, I tried to distract myself. I collected more firewood, paced the room, checked the windows again and again. Every time I went outside, I felt eyes on me, even when I couldn't see anything. The cabin itself seemed to resist comfort. The floorboards creaked under the lightest step. The stove rattled oddly when the fire burned too brightly. The windows reflected shadows that didn't belong to me. Small, subtle things moved when I wasn't looking. A chair shifted slightly. A rock near the porch rolled out of place. The firewood I stacked earlier was disturbed. I felt watched even in broad daylight. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag quickly, my hands shaking. Every sound outside made me jump. When I opened the door, my stomach sank. Fresh footprints led directly to the porch, ending at the cabin door. One set, a single, deliberate path that stopped there, as if someone had been standing silently, waiting. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the car, jumped in, locked the doors, and drove down the narrow dirt road as fast as I could manage, barely able to focus on the rough terrain. My pulse raced, my hands trembled, and every shadow in the trees seemed to reach for me. I didn't slow down until I reached the main paved road, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I exhale. Only then did I realize my body had been shaking uncontrollably. Weeks later, I checked the cabin listing online. It was still up, but the photos seemed older than what I remembered. One detail stood out. The cabin in the pictures had no curtains. The cabin I stayed in had old, dark curtains, frayed at the edges, and clearly in use. Someone had been living here. Someone had been watching me the entire time without ever making a sound. I kept thinking about it. The footprints, the moved firewood, the chair shifted on the porch, the subtle sounds outside that I tried to rationalize. The fear wasn't in what they did. It was in what they chose not to do. They never entered the cabin. They never confronted me, but they could have. The real danger wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was a person or people who knew the woods and the cabin better than I ever could, who could move through it silently, and who were completely aware of my presence the entire time. The ending became clear over time. I escaped, yes. I made it home safely, but the survival wasn't because of luck or intelligence. It was because they decided to let me go. They were patient, careful, observant, and familiar with the space in ways I wasn't. I had been entirely vulnerable, yet they had chosen not to harm me. That realization stayed with me long after the adrenaline faded. Now, whenever I think about that cabin, I don't remember the cold or the darkness. I remember the quiet, the deliberate steps in the dirt, the stillness in the trees, and the feeling of being watched by someone who moved unseen, who could have ended everything in seconds but didn't. The cabin wasn't haunted by anything supernatural. It was haunted by reality, by the knowledge that someone else, real and patient, had the ability to control that small, isolated space in the woods and could remain completely unseen while I existed entirely in their world. I never went back. I never stayed in another isolated cabin. The memory is clear. Isolation isn't the absence of danger, and silence isn't the absence of awareness. The real horror isn't in what you see. It's in what you can't, and knowing that someone capable, deliberate, and patient is out there watching and waiting while you sleep or sit quietly, thinking you're alone. I survived that cabin because of their choice, not mine, and that knowledge, that clarity, is what haunts me more than anything else ever could. I drove into the mountains with the sun already low, casting long shadows between the trees that lined the narrow road. The cabin I had booked was miles from the nearest town, somewhere off a trail that barely qualified as a road. My GPS had died hours ago, leaving me dependent on a paper map and the fading light. The car bounced over gravel and potholes, each turn bringing me deeper into the forest, until the world outside my windows had become nothing but trunks and shadows. When I finally saw the cabin, it seemed almost too quiet, too small, too out of place. It sat in a clearing so tight that the surrounding trees blocked much of the sky. The wooden exterior was dark and weathered, and the roof sagged slightly, hinting at years of neglect. A small porch leaned to one side, and a single metal chair, rusted and dented, rested near the door as if left by someone who had walked away years ago. The windows were clouded, the glass streaked with dirt, and the air around the clearing felt unusually still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt the difference in the air. It wasn't cold, exactly, but it carried a weight I hadn't noticed on the way up. The ground beneath my boots was soft, littered with pine needles, fallen branches, and the occasional rock. I approached the cabin slowly, listening to my own footsteps, aware of the eerie silence. When I finally reached the door, the metal handle was cold under my hand, and I noticed for the first time that the door had no lock, just a simple latch. Inside, the smell of old wood and dust was overwhelming. The cabin was small, with a single main room that contained everything. A bed pushed into one corner, a table with two mismatched chairs, a small kitchen area with a sink and a wood stove, and a door leading to a cramped bathroom with cracked tiles. The furniture was simple, functional, and covered in a thin layer of dust. Everything seemed intact, but nothing felt welcoming. The air inside was stagnant, as if it had been trapped there for weeks. I unpacked my bag slowly, trying to convince myself that I was here to relax. I stacked firewood near the stove, though it wasn't cold enough to need it yet, and then stepped outside to inspect the clearing. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were human, fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. I froze, my stomach tightening. My first thought was that they were from a previous guest, or maybe the owner had been here recently. But the prints were too clean, too deliberate, too fresh to ignore. They circled the cabin and disappeared into the trees as if someone had been pacing, watching, waiting. I tried to shake it off and went about preparing for the night. The sun sank quickly behind the mountains, and the temperature dropped. I lit a fire in the stove, the flames casting flickering shadows across the walls, and ate a simple meal. Every sound felt louder, sharper. The creak of the floorboards, the soft pop of the fire, the occasional scrape against the walls. I told myself it was just the cabin settling or the wind outside, but the unease in my chest refused to dissipate. As night fell, the cabin seemed smaller, the walls closing in. I lay on the bed, fully dressed, listening to the faint sounds of the forest outside. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. They weren't the quick scuttle of an animal. They weren't the brush of wind against the trees. They were measured human steps. My heart jumped, my chest tightening as I lay motionless, barely breathing. The footsteps moved along the perimeter, pausing at times near the windows. They lingered long enough for me to feel their presence without ever seeing them. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded into the trees, fading with the darkness. I didn't sleep, not a minute. My body was tense, my mind alert to every sound. By morning, the footprints were still there, more added alongside the first ones. Someone had spent the night moving around the cabin, pacing, observing. The knowledge that I had been watched while I slept made the air inside the cabin feel even heavier. The day dragged on. I tried to stay busy, collecting more firewood, checking the perimeter, pacing the room. Every time I looked outside, I felt eyes on me, though there was never anything to see. The cabin itself seemed to resist comfort. The floorboards creaked under my lightest step, the stove rattled oddly when the fire burned too high, and small items shifted slightly when I wasn't looking. A chair I had positioned near the table moved an inch. A rock near the porch rolled a few feet. The firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered. All subtle, almost invisible movements, but deliberate enough to make me certain someone had been moving through the space when I wasn't paying attention. I realized then that staying another night was impossible. I packed quickly, my hands trembling, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every sound outside made me flinch. When I opened the front door, my stomach sank. Fresh footprints led straight up to the porch, ending at the cabin door. One set, deliberate, stopping there as if someone had been standing silently, waiting. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the car, locked the doors, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could manage, barely noticing the rough terrain beneath my tires. I didn't slow down until I hit the main paved road miles away. Weeks later, I looked up the cabin listing online out of curiosity. It was still there, but the photos were older than I remembered. One detail stood out. The cabin in the pictures had no curtains, but the cabin I stayed in had dark, frayed curtains, clearly in use. Someone had been living there, or at least using the cabin regularly, and I had been completely unaware. They had been patient, careful, moving silently around the cabin while I stayed inside. Thinking back, I understood what had happened. The fear hadn't been in what the person did. It was in what they chose not to do. They never entered the cabin. They never confronted me, but they could have. They were familiar with the woods, familiar with the cabin, and completely aware of my presence. They had watched me, circled the cabin, moved objects subtly, and never revealed themselves. The real danger had been the person, human, deliberate, and patient, and I had been utterly vulnerable. The ending was clear after reflection. I survived because they let me, not because I was clever or lucky, but because they chose not to harm me. The lesson stayed with me long after I left the mountains. Isolation isn't safety. Silence isn't peace. Danger isn't always visible. Someone could be watching, moving unseen, and the only reason you escape is because they decide to let you. I never went back. I never stayed in a cabin so far from civilization again. And every time I think about that forest, that small, dark cabin, I feel the same tension in my chest. The knowledge that the person could have done anything, and I would have had no defense. That realization is the part that still haunts me, long after the footprints have faded. The trees have grown taller, and the cabin has disappeared from view. The real horror wasn't the dark, the isolation, or the cold. It was knowing that someone else controlled that space entirely, moved within it with patience and intent, and had complete awareness of my every action. I survived, but only because they allowed it. The thought of returning, even years later, fills me with a dread I can't shake, because the woods are still there, and the person might still be moving through them, patient, silent, and deliberate.